Isometric exercises are as old as human history itself. One striking historical example is the development of the bow. The earliest archaeological finds of bows date back to the boundary between the late Paleolithic and early Mesolithic periods, approximately 12,000 to 10,000 years BC. Drawing and especially maintaining a taut bowstring required pronounced isometric contractions of the latissimus dorsi, posterior deltoids, rhomboids, spinal extensors, forearm and hand muscles, and core stabilizers. At full draw, the archer stabilized the position of the shoulder girdle and rib cage, maintaining the force without moving. This is classic isometrics. In any case, isometrics is as old as written history. Ancient Eastern scrolls and carvings depict warriors in the horseman's stance, an isometric stance that is still used in martial arts to develop strength and endurance. In many Eastern martial arts, key movements and strikes are performed from isometric positions and holds. Static stances, where the fighter holds a position for an extended period, develop leg and tendon strength and the ability to maintain tension under load. Karate isometric tension underlies the instantaneous body composure at the moment of impact, when the entire body freezes for a split second and transmits force. In Aikido and Judo, many techniques begin with isometric control of the grip and body, where force is generated not through movement, but by maintaining and transmitting tension through the body's structure. In Chinese styles, static postures are of great importance, where strength development begins with holding a pose without moving. Isometry is the foundation of yoga, and asana is essentially a prolonged isometric hold. The Old Testament provides a vivid example of isometric strength. The biblical hero Samson, blind and chained, was brought to the temple for the amusement of the crowd. Leaning on two supporting columns, he strained his entire body, and holding them under the colossal load, brought down the building. In this episode, strength is demonstrated not through movement or acceleration, but through extreme static effort, a classic example of isometric tension taken to its maximum. Isometrics have always been an integral part of human movement, strength, and survival. Long before barbells, exercise machines, or even the very idea of systematic training, the true potential of isometrics began to be systematized and realized in the early 20th century. It is this period that is most often associated with isometric training, as it was then that strongmen such as Errol Lederman, Alexander Zass, Eugen Sandow, Georg Hackenschmidt, Arthur Saxon, Louis Cyr, Maxick, and many others began actively using static tension and holds to develop strength and endurance, demonstrating outstanding results without modern technology or equipment. Errol Lederman wrote in his book The Secret of Strength about the benefits of practicing extreme contraction exercises. Isometrics literally saved Alexander Zass's life. At the very beginning of World War I, in 1914, Zass was seriously wounded by a shell in both legs and was captured by the Austrians. Zass developed his strength by pulling on the chains with which he was bound. Over time, he became so powerful that he managed to escape from 4 different camps where he was held. The first scientific studies on the effects of isometric exercise on the body began during World War I and continued into the post-war years. In particular, scientists were faced with the challenge of rehabilitating wounded soldiers and returning the male population to active life. To address the problem of atrophy, many medical institutions received government funding. One such institution was Springfield College. To analyze the rate of atrophy in immobilized soldiers, researchers began experimenting with amphibians, specifically frogs. In the experiment, the frogs were securely immobilized with only one leg, effectively creating a strong splint that prevented any movement of the restrained limb. They were then returned to the aquarium, allowing free use of the other leg. 2 weeks later, the researchers returned to the amphibians to record the extent to which the immobilized legs had atrophied. As expected, the free limb appeared normal. The frogs used it for normal locomotion. However, what they discovered on the bound legs was completely counterintuitive. The bound leg hadn't atrophied at all. On the contrary, it had noticeably grown larger. It almost seemed like they were pumped up with muscles. The bound legs were not only larger, but also significantly stronger than before. When the frogs were placed on the ground, they jumped great distances, but because one leg had become significantly stronger than the other, with a diagonal trajectory, the bound leg was so much stronger than the free one that the amphibians had to relearn how to jump straight. Why did this happen? For 2 weeks, the frogs tried to push their bound leg against the splint. Even though the limb didn't move, the muscles actively tensed. This is precisely what led to astonishing increases in strength and size. Until the second half of the 20th century, isometric exercises were popular only in narrow circles, as part of specialized training or as a method of injury recovery. Let's pause here and define isometrics and its main types. Isometric contractions occur when muscles generate force without changing length, essentially holding a position without moving. There are two main types of isometric training: yielding and overcoming. Yielding isometrics is what many people picture when they hear the term isometrics. This is holding a position or weight for a certain amount of time. For example, a chair against a wall or holding a dumbbell at arm's length. Overcoming isometrics is attempting to push or pull a stationary object. For example, trying to move a wall, bend a piece of metal, or break a chain. There are other types of isometrics. They either belong to one of the two main types or are a combination of both. The boundaries between them are blurred, but this helps structure the program and measure the effect. Quasi-isometry, which is closer to yielding, is the goal here, to perform a full range of motion as slowly as possible. To the point where a pull-up or push-up can take several minutes. You learn to precisely control your efforts. You need to activate or release just the right amount of motor units to move smoothly up or down. You train yourself to maintain constant focus throughout the entire movement. You feel muscle feedback. This helps you correct your technique. Oscillatory isometrics, small, quick movements around an isometric position to stimulate reflexive muscle activation. Examples: while holding a squat, slightly bouncing a few centimeters with a pulse, a split squat, or a pulse push-up. Hold the bottom position and perform small, controlled up and down movements. This improves neuromuscular efficiency and dynamic stability, especially under load. Strength pauses involve holding at specific points in the movement, often in the least advantageous mechanical position or at maximum stretch. For example, a pause in the deadlift increases strength and control in weak points. Ballistic isometrics improve overall movement efficiency. Ballistic isometrics is sometimes called explosive isometrics. This may seem contradictory, but the essence is explosive intent. The idea is to instantly, with maximum force, attack a stationary object or explode from a static position. In other words, it's an explosive transition from isometric to powerful movement. This can increase your starting strength and ability to quickly reach peak power. A similar movement pattern is present, for example, in American football, when you explode from a static position into a sprint or attack an opponent. In sprinting, swimming, arm wrestling, and many other athletic disciplines, the next important stage in the development of isometrics was the contribution of Bob Hoffman in the 1960s and 1970s. Bob Hoffman is a record holder in weightlifting, with over 60 trophies and awards to his credit. After decades of international competition and coaching, Hoffman concluded that isometric training is the greatest and most productive strength training method in existence. He wrote a book on isometric training. He invented and patented the isometric rack, now known as the power rack. Essentially, it was a device in which a loaded barbell was held by metal pins. This method worked incredibly quickly, producing several champions and gaining a reputation as an incredibly effective way to develop strength. Hoffman based his exercises on classical weightlifting. He identified 12 basic isometric holds, which were the key points of the snatch and clean and jerk. Each set was performed with maximum effort. When the athlete could hold the weight statically for 12 seconds, the weight was increased. Around this same time, German engineer Kolbe invented the Bullworker isometric device. From the 1970s to the 1990s, bodybuilding became the main popularizer of strength training worldwide. It was he who shaped the popular understanding of how to train for muscle growth. Magazines, competitions, videotapes, and iconic stage figures. All of this made bodybuilding the flagship of strength culture. The range of methods was extremely broad: high-volume training, split systems, intensity principles, supersets, drop sets, forced reps. Static work was considered, at best, an auxiliary element for posing, pauses at the top, and holds for finishing. Full-fledged isometrics as a standalone hypertrophy method was rarely taken seriously. One of the first to systematically use isometrics specifically for bodybuilding was John Little. He experimented with heavy static holds as the primary growth stimulus. Little's logic was simple yet radical. If maximal mechanical load is the key factor in growth, then short-term extreme tension can be no less effective than dozens of repetitions. He experimented with holds in a power rack, locking the weight in a power position with an emphasis on maximal motor unit activation. The duration of the sets was short, but the intensity was close to the absolute limit. The basis of these experiments was Hanneman's principle, formulated by neurophysiologist Elwood Hanneman in the 1950s and 1960s, and called the size principle. Its essence lies in the fact that motor units are activated not randomly, but in a strictly defined sequence. When a muscle begins to contract, small motor units, type 1 fibers, are activated first. As the required force increases, larger motor units, fast-twitch type 2A fibers, are recruited, followed by 2X. The higher the required tension, the more and more powerfully the fibers are recruited. The body always conserves resources and doesn't activate high-threshold units unless the load requires it. In dynamic training, they are often accessed only at the end of a difficult set or when working with heavy weights. In maximum effort isometric exercises, they can be activated immediately if a person creates maximum or near maximum tension, especially in static exercises. The nervous system is forced to recruit high-threshold motor units almost immediately. This became the theoretical basis for heavy isometric exercises. Little conducted practical experiments. According to his claims and published reports, some of his subjects demonstrated impressive mass gains, up to approximately 14 kilograms in 10 weeks, using only heavy static holds. These figures were controversial and questionable, but the very fact of the experiments was a significant event. For the first time, isometrics were presented not as an auxiliary tool, but as an independent hypertrophy strategy in bodybuilding. While isometrics in the United States experienced waves of popularity and skepticism, ranging from a revolutionary method to a passing fad, in the Soviet Union it wasn't perceived as something exotic or sensational. Within the framework of Soviet sports science, isometric tension was considered one of the working tools for developing strength in functional training. It wasn't contrasted with dynamic training, but rather integrated into the overall system of training tools. As early as the 1950s and 1960s, specialized sports journals and methodological collections published materials on the use of isometric exercises in the training of Soviet athletes, where static tension was analyzed alongside dynamic methods. Static exercises were described as a means of strengthening the ligamentous apparatus, increasing strength at fixed angles, developing static endurance, and promoting rehabilitation after injuries. In the USSR, they were viewed pragmatically, as one of the modes of muscular work. The Soviet school of thought was based on the principle of comprehensiveness. Strength development must take into account all forms of muscle contraction. Scientific data proves the effectiveness of isometric exercises and has a clear physiological basis. In some cases, it even outperforms dynamic exercises. One of the most significant and well-established principles of isometric training is that tendons respond particularly well to heavy isometric loading. Sports medicine research has shown that intense static holds can quickly reduce pain. Claims for pathologies. Tendons literally thrive on heavy isometric loading without the cyclical tissue irritation that occurs with repeated dynamic movements. As a result, isometrics not only doesn't increase pain, but can actually reduce it, while simultaneously strengthening tendon structures. This is why isometrics has never disappeared from rehabilitation practice. Its main advantage is the ability to perform local muscle work without joint movement. In the early recovery phase, strength gains with isometric holds often occur faster than with dynamic holds, as the body can safely activate muscle fibers without the risk of re-injury. These same properties make isometric holds one of the most gentle forms of strength training. The risk of acute ruptures is reduced, chronic joint overload is reduced, and overall wear and tear on the musculoskeletal system is reduced. The holding phases create sustained high-level activation of motor units, which generates a powerful stimulus for the nervous system. During dynamic movement, the peak of maximum force lasts for a fraction of a second. Inertia quickly carries the weight through the most difficult section. In isometric exercises, this section can be fixed and held. This concentration of effort makes the workout extremely time-efficient. A few minutes of intense static contractions can provide a stimulus comparable to much longer weight training sessions. The potential for muscle mass and strength gains is equal to or even greater than with dynamic movements. Recovery between sets and during breaks between workouts is faster because there is no significant mechanical damage to the tissues, allowing isometric training to be performed more frequently. A number of studies and practices show that strength gains increase by 3 to 5% per week, a truly superhuman rate of strength gain. One of the key advantages of isometrics is that it fits perfectly with the principle of ideal adaptation. Frequent, controlled loads of moderate volume produce more sustainable progress than infrequent ones. In overly intense training, the body adapts not to single feats, but to repeated stimuli. This approach aligns with one of the fundamental tenets of the conditioning school. Volume is more important than intensity. It's not about an endless number of repetitions. A frequent training stimulus creates sustainable adaptations, strengthens connective tissues, and gradually increases performance potential. Isometrics take this concept to its practical extreme. It allows for high levels of muscular tension, even reaching maximum or submaximal efforts, while avoiding significant mechanical damage to muscle fibers, which is typical of heavy dynamic work with an eccentric phase. Since there is no significant stretching under load or cyclic microtrauma, recovery is faster. The nervous system receives a powerful stimulus, but muscle tissue is not subjected to such severe structural damage. This reduces the risk of chronic fatigue, inflammation, and overtraining. Bob Hoffman understood this well. He recommended performing isometric training 4 to 6 days a week, reserving 1 day for dynamic barbell work. Essentially, this was a practical implementation of the idea of frequent strength training without excessive overload. Beyond using isometrics as a means of increasing strength, isometrics should be part of any program in any type of athletics or training. For one simple reason: it literally saves you. In super training, Verkhoshansky describes the concept of emergency stabilizers, muscles that activate at critical moments of loading when the joint requires additional protection. Most injuries occur not in the easy phases of movement, but in sticking points, where speed is minimal, leverage is unfavorable, and mechanical advantage is almost non-existent. Under these conditions, the demands on active stabilization are greatest. If the muscular system fails to create sufficient rigidity, the load is transferred to the ligaments and joint structures, resulting in injury. Isometric training directly enhances this protective mechanism. Regular static contractions teach muscles to engage quickly and powerfully under high tension. At the sticking point, not only the force of the movement is important, but also the rigidity of the entire kinematic chain. Stabilizers are muscles that hold a body segment steady while others perform movements. In static mode, they work isometrically or quasi-isometrically. For example, the spinal erectors hold the core during push-ups, transmitting force from the chest and shoulders. Without this rigidity, the movement becomes ineffective and injury-prone. With dynamic stabilization, the muscles simultaneously move and stabilize the joint, like the quadriceps during running. Stabilization isn't passive support, but active control of position under load. If the active system is weak, the passive structures, such as the ligaments, become overloaded. Emergency stabilizers provide an additional layer of protection. They are activated at peak effort or fatigue, when the movement begins to fall apart. Basic principles of isometric training. 1. A thorough warm-up and deep warm-up. A formal warm-up is not enough before isometric exercises. The body should be really warmed up. Light cardio until you sweat. Joint mobilization. Dynamic activation of large muscle groups. All of this is not just acceptable, but necessary. Isometrics has a distinctive feature. Unlike dynamic strength work, where fatigue accumulates linearly, with static tension, the nervous system often engages gradually. Those who have already trained with isometric exercises know that by the 5th set, they feel stronger than in the first. So warming up here doesn't hinder, but rather enhances the effect. The hotter and more active the nervous system, the better the quality of the isometric contraction. 2. Breathing principles. Never hold your breath. Holding your breath during isometric exercises is especially dangerous due to the sudden increase in pressure. Since static tension partially restricts muscle blood flow, the additional restriction of breathing increases the strain on the cardiovascular system. Breathing should be conscious, even, and synchronized with the effort. As tension increases, you continue to breathe calmly. Focusing on your breathing is just as important as focusing on the muscle itself. 3. Principle: total body engagement. Even if the exercise targets a single muscle group, the isometric approach shouldn't be localized. Each approach involves consciously engaging the entire muscular frame, including the core, glutes, and target muscles. The body works as a unified system from shoulders to toes. The core and support muscles are engaged, but the face, jaw, and eyes remain relaxed. We discussed core work and strength training in detail in this video. Click the link in the upper right corner and see the description. 4. Principle: match time and intensity. You can see the intensity level chart on the screen. The nature of isometric exercises varies significantly depending on the duration of the hold and the level of effort. Light isometric exercises lasting 60 seconds or more employ moderate, relatively uniform tension. This is a mode for developing endurance and tissue resilience. In the 6 to 15 second strength range, which Verkhoshansky described as wave-like, tension increases gradually over the first 3 to 5 seconds, then is maintained at a high level for another 3 to 5 seconds, and then gradually decreases. It's important to avoid sudden increases and sudden drops in effort. It's the gradual increase and controlled decrease that promote optimal neuromuscular adaptation and reduce the risk of overload. A separate mode is explosive isometrics. This involves the fastest possible activation of force, reaching a peak in a split second and holding it for 1 to 3 seconds. This format is used to develop speed and strength and requires a high level of preparation. Warming up and mastering technique are especially important here, as the stress on the nervous system and connective tissues is at its maximum. This regimen is not intended for beginners and should be used sparingly. Principle 5. Decompression after training is essential. This was emphasized by Verkhoshansky, Hoffman, and Bruce Lee. Isometric exercises create significant axial tension and internal compression, especially when performing racks, presses, squats, or deadlifts. At the end of the workout, the spine should be relieved and the tissues should be gently restored to length. The classic option is hanging from a bar, as used by Hoffman and Bruce Lee. Alternatives include gentle traction, stretching, and breathing relaxation. This restores spinal mobility. Rest periods between holds, as well as the number of workouts per week, vary greatly, from 1 to 6 workouts per week and from 10 seconds to 3 minutes. There's a wide range here, depending on your goals, technique, intensity, and experience. Almost the entirety of this video is based on the book Isometry to the Max, which details isometric programs and training protocols for various specializations. It covers the approaches of Verkhoshansky, Bruce Lee, and Hoffman, the methods of old-school strongmen, the specifics of isometrics for powerlifting, martial arts weightlifting, isotraining for strength hypertrophy, and many other nuances of integrating isometric approaches into training. The full translation of the book is available on Boosty. The link is in the comments and profile header. Why? Despite isometrics having such a broad scientific and empirically proven basis, is it not very popular and is considered by some to be almost a separate subculture within strength training? The main problem is psychological. This is especially true for athletes accustomed to very high-intensity training. The lack of movement seems unsettling to them. Even if they're familiar with the research, at some level they doubt how a strong push, not a pulling effort, can even be a productive training methodology. The belief persists that isometric strength is not true strength and doesn't translate to dynamic exercise. Unfortunately, the lack of this feeling of exhaustion that intense training provides may be one of the reasons why many exercisers hold a biased attitude toward isometrics. If a workout doesn't leave me exhausted and sore, it can't be effective, they reason. This is an outdated notion, but pain no gain is a fallacy based on subjective psychological biases, not science. Soreness and fatigue may create the feeling of hard work, but in reality, they are not a reliable indicator of productive strength training. The only truly reliable indicator is an athlete's ability to handle progressively increasing loads. And all the evidence points to the fact that isometrics is unrivaled in this regard. Steinhaus, a physiologist who brought isometrics into the spotlight in the 1950s, argued that the reason athletes sometimes reject isometrics is psychological, not biological. He believed that athletes in any system that makes training easier seem wrong to them, even if it is actually correct. In his classic book, The Psychology of Muscular Activity, sports ideologist Peter Vladimirovich Karpovich reached similar conclusions. He noted the astonishing results of isometric strength training, but wrote that many dismiss isometric training because it seems to contradict everyday experience. Everyone thinks of strongmen as those who work 1 to 2 hours a day, 3 days a week, to develop strength. Most people would simply find it strange, or fear being judged, to have to go to the gym and pull, squeeze, and resist an empty, fixed Smith machine bar. And here we encounter an interesting paradox. Isometrics are objectively effective, but subjectively they don't feel like hard work. Isometrics lacks the outward drama, There's no dynamic display, no pronounced muscle destruction. It all feels almost like immobility. If you were offered a method that would produce comparable or even better strength gains, allow you to train more frequently, recover faster, and not destroy your body, but at the same time avoid the feeling of heroic suffering and look unusual, would you choose the results or the feeling of hard work? What's the true marker of a productive workout for you? Objective strength gains or subjective fatigue and pain? And the most important point, if you're skeptical about isometrics, is it based on your personal experience or an inner feeling that it can't work? I'd be very interested to hear detailed answers and real-life experiences, both positive and critical.